Hey everybody, this is Doug Guardsman. So I want to go ahead and show off the thing I've kind of been working on stream for the last, I don't know, couple weeks. So we can show visually what this is really quick. So this is Storybook. This is not what I'm working on, but this is a tool I'm using to kind of work on things. So I've been slowly building my way through building a UI to display and edit JSON files. Now we're not to the editing point, but I have got the viewing part done. And that may not sound that remarkable, but it kind of is when I show you the way I had to go through getting this to work, so that way I can theoretically handle any kind of JSON file and have it display any kind of component I wanted to go through. So for the most part, here's kind of the crafting grid. We can do 2x2s, we can do 3x3s, it handles no JSON. I have individual concepts for handling loading items. I have individual concepts for it handling slots. I can do rows of items, which is probably not useful for most things, but you know, later if we add Tinker support or other things, it might become more useful. And then of course we got the grid. So not super impressive visually to look at, but it kind of is neat because it is using CSS to do a lot of the background. So like all the slots, rendering the lines between them, those aren't images being pulled from somewhere and rendered. Those are CSS, so it can be dynamically adjusted, size can be changed. The images are pulled directly from renders from the game. I'm using somebody's block render mod for this. I plan to build my own as I go because I need more customizability, more automation for this, so that way we can start handling not only vanilla renders, but any mod we're looking at. As for the app itself, this is what it looks like. It's not beautiful. We're going to work through that at some point on the stream and make it look really nice. I'm kind of leaning towards using Minecraft visuals for most of the UI, just because it will give it that feel I'm heading for direction-wise, although I plan to make this work for more than just Minecraft, so we'll have to figure out what we want that visual to look like long-term. But right now it is looking at my actual ICBM folder. I have not hard-coded this to tell it where recipes are. I have not told it anything other than I have a folder here, I have a project, and its name is ICBM. It is detecting everything. It's actually detecting far more than what is being shown on the screen, but I've got it filtered down to only show recipes right now. So I can go in here, I can actually find all my recipes, I can do file exploring, I've got a scroll bar, you know the normal stuff. Right now, it's not fully functional just because it doesn't know what it's kind of looking at, so I can click into bomb cart, it'll display my JSON for me, and I can come over here and I can go to view mode, but it's going to go error because it doesn't know what these items are. I'm still getting to that point. But it does actually process it. It actually goes through and it goes, hey, I have a result, I have a pattern, I have type, I have a key. The types is how it's actually identifying what these files are. So it's going in, it's going, hey, I have a recipe folder. So it's using regex to identify that we are in the recipe folder. And then once it's in the recipe folder, it goes, okay, what am I looking at? It goes, well, I'm looking at craft, shaped recipes. I also have handling to look at ICBM explosive recipes, which is the whole reason I'm building this application, is I got tired of manually editing my shaped recipes to convert them over to the explosive recipes, because once we get into the explosive recipes, they're going to be a little easier to deal with, because I can tell it like, hey, you're looking at this explosive, and that's what you're going to output, rather than what I was doing previously, which is like you're looking at this item, the item has a metadata value of 10, and I'm like, well, I don't know what that is. And it's kind of, it feels like wasteful time doing this to some extent, because as soon as we migrate out of 112, I don't have to worry about metadata anymore. There will be one block ID per thing, or one item per thing. But this is kind of the visual part. It's kind of where we're heading direction-wise in that thing. Now, the part I really want to show off is I basically built my own programming language inside of JSON. Now, I've done this before in the past, so people who are familiar with what VoltsEngine was, VoltsEngine had a system baked into it that was Java-based that could process a JSON file, and from that JSON file could run rudimentary logic on it. I'm in JavaScript, so I can't just go copy it one-to-one, and I didn't even bother to even go look at the old version. I was just like, on stream, I'm like, I want to build this, and I started doing the schema really, really quickly of how I want this to look like. Did my type defs, because we're in TypeScript, so I got to do a whole bunch of type defs, which is really silly and annoying, but it works. And I was like, okay, so here's what we want to do. We know we want to generate components. So this was based off the concept of, anybody who's ever looked at the APIs for Microsoft Teams, you can display components from a bot or another piece of software. At work, we don't actually use bots for a lot of this. We actually use curl commands to post messages to Microsoft Teams to tell us when our pipelines fail, when we have something break, or when we're just doing informational from our systems. So I'm like, oh, that does components. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell it like, hey, I have a component. I want to do an item grid. And here's how I access my data. It's going to be a pattern field. Well, if you look at the pattern field, and I can come over here and show that, the pattern field is a series of strings. That doesn't really tell us what our items are. So we need to do processing. So the processing goes through, and the first thing it needs to do is it needs to convert that those rows of strings into characters, because all of our things that we actually do for crafting recipes, at least in this version. I don't know what the newer versions look like. I'm assuming they're still pretty close to the same, but they operate off of characters. We know that C is equivalent to some kind of item in the list, and it shows us up here with my comments like what we're working on, where we want to split an array with a string into it into an array of character strings. So that's our first step. It's then going to map it again, and it's going to get an input of that character thing. So it just did that from a previous step. It wants to map that, which is going to get an input of a single array, and it's going to go through and it's going to do some basic things. First, it's going to look to replace things. So if you have a blank slot, so say you did like C space C, it's going to get rid of that and turn it to null. That's just a convenience factor because we know it's blank, we know it's null. We want to make sure to tell the system that don't try to render anything, don't try to look anything up from the server. There's nothing there. Then we do some checks. We want to go like, hey, we only want to run you if there's something defined, because if this comes back null, we don't want to do a lookup on there. There's nothing there for us to look up. So, but if we do have something defined, it's going to do a lookup. This is where it actually maps back to the key system. So it goes, hey, I have a character. I then need to look up on my key system, and I need to go grab it. So my letter A is going to correspond to anvil. So it'll go grab that for me. It'll look it up, and it will pop it in there, and it's going to grab entry. So entry is just telling it like, hey, when we're going to map, you have entry and index are your only two arguments. I want to take my entry thing, and I want to pass that in to my lookup to go grab stuff. So it's going to convert that off from C to chest, for example. It's then going to do a switch, because it's going to go, okay, well, I don't know what data I'm exactly looking at, but I know I'm going to have some kind of data. I'm going to recognize some kind of format. Now, we don't have support for like tags, list, or dictionary, custom entries just yet. I'm going to add those later, and I'm probably going to have to build another system just to handle that, because custom entry is very broad. Each mod is going to have its own conception of what a custom entry looks like and means. ICBM has one that's going to have a type of like ICBM explosive. So that's going to be a custom entry that's going to be supported, and effectively I'm going to have to build a registry of like, how do you convert an item from a custom entry back into a normal item for display? And then how do you go from that normal item back into the custom entry so for storage? Because it's going to have to read this file, it's going to have to let you edit it, and it's going to have to save this file again. But when it gets to the switch, it's going to run some conditional logic. It's going to go like, hey, I want to check to see that this contains the data field. If we contain the data field, I want to really quickly run the formatting on it to output this key that has a metadata on the end of it. This is only going to be useful for older versions. As we go into newer versions, we're not going to care. I then want to do a different conditional path. So if like this path doesn't work, my default is I just want to post the item name, because that might be the only thing I have in that system. And in quite a few of these files, that's all that is in there. But a lot of the files, I'm going to see this, because at one point when we were doing JSON stuff, it was required to have that data field. I don't believe it is required anymore. So we're going to have cases where we will have the data 0, we'll have cases where we don't, and I'm going to have to probably add some logic to try to parse both of them, which is going to be interesting because the system really doesn't know how to do that. But we'll get to that point and figure out how to make it work and everything else. But yeah, we got a whole language here. We have other components, like it tells us the arrow is going to be posted there. Now when it comes to the UI, which I showed that has an arrow into, I can go all the way back here and grab it. It has a bit of an ugly arrow. That arrow is literally just coming from an icon pack. I'm going to replace that with an actual arrow that looks like a Minecraft arrow. So we'll get to that point as we go. We even have the result section. The result section does like literally the same thing. It just goes, hey, item data format. This is the reason I need to make this reusable up here, is there will be a case when you want to make this reusable. You want to use the same data down here. So we'll get to that. And it also does additional thing where it's going to grab the count. We don't render the counts in the UI just yet, but that'll be as we go. For the actual component stuff, for those who are not familiar, this is React code. You just tell it like, hey, I have a function. We are using functional programming. There's a class-based version of this as well, but it isn't used anymore. And I'm using TypeScript, so you will see like a lot of these types pop over here, even though this is JavaScript. I have not documented anything, which is the reason why you're not seeing my usual comments in here. I got really lazy on stream and just was like, I want to build components. But this is hard-coded right now to only identify crafting recipes. When I get to that point where I've gotten further down the list, it's going to get a JSON. It's going to ask the server, what am I looking at? The server is going to tell it, here's your processing schema. And that processing schema is going to tell it, how do you build all your components? We're going to have to add more components here. So like, even though we're going to have a processing schema, we're still going to have to build the components. So I'm still going to have to build my item grid. I'm still going to have to build my results. I'm still going to have to build my arrows. But that's not as bad as having to hard code all this. Because if we were doing this hard coded process, I would have to, for each version of Minecraft, identify the version we are staring at, identify the file we're staring at, then do this whole hard-coded system up here as actual code. Now, if I did this hard-coded, it'd be a little bit faster, but then this file would start to bloat. I would have a 1.12 version, a 1.13 version, a 1.14 version, a 1.15. Now, as we go forward, the versioning and the differences between the JSON files as we go versioning is not probably going to be that bad, but it is still something to consider and still something to think about when we're going to do it. Anyways, I'm going to leave it here because I need to go to a convention here in a few minutes. But I wanted to go ahead and share this so people that don't watch the streams can actually keep up with what I'm doing and don't think I'm just being lazy and not updating mods. But we'll be back with hopefully more content and more regular intervals.